Hello dear listeners, and welcome to Fireside Mysteries. Edward here, so glad you've joined me again. Tell me, what's your favourite warm drink to enjoy while listening to these mysteries? Tea, cocoa, or perhaps a cosy cup of coffee? I love hearing about the small comforts that make your evening special, and of course do subscribe if you haven't already. Now, get comfortable. The mystery awaits. Chapter 1. The Bitter Wind and the Bad Historian. The fog rolled into Lochdubh like an unwelcome relative, thick and sullen, blotting out the mountains and muffling the sound of the waves against the harbour wall. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of his kitchen, watching the grey blanket descend upon his beloved village, and felt a prickle of unease at the back of his neck. It was the sort of fog that the old folk said brought trouble with it. Hamish was a tall, lazy streak of a man with hazel eyes and red hair that refused to lie flat no matter how much he tried to tame it. At this particular moment, he was perfectly content to ignore the stack of paperwork Detective Chief Inspector Blair had sent over from Strathbane. Instead, he was engaged in the far more important task of feeding his dog, Lugs, a mongrel with a blue eye and a brown eye and ears that stood up like radar dishes, and Sonsi, his wild cat, who was purring like a small engine as she wound herself round his ankles. The telephone rang. Hamish eyed it with deep suspicion. Nothing good ever came from a ringing telephone on a foggy day in the Highlands. He let it ring 6 times before his conscience got the better of him, and he picked up the receiver. "Macbeth," he said. "Hamish." It was the voice of Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, booming down the line with the force of a Highland gale. "You'd better get yourself down to the Lochdubh Arms. There's a right nasty Sassenach here causing trouble." Hamish sighed. "What sort of trouble?" "The worst sort. He's insulting everyone and making threats about people's homes. Ian says you need to come before someone takes a swing at him." Hamish looked down at Lugs and Sonsi, who were now settled contentedly by the peat fire. He looked at his comfortable armchair. He looked at the fog pressing against the windows. "I'll be there directly," he said, and hung up with a sigh. He pulled on his regulation jacket, and he settled his peaked cap on his unruly hair and stepped out into the bitter cold. The fog wrapped around him like a damp shroud, and he could barely see 10 feet in front of him as he made his way down the main street toward the pub. The Lochdubh Arms was warm and bright, a haven against the grey world outside. But the usual cheerful babble of voices had been replaced by a tense, angry murmur. Hamish pushed open the door and was immediately assaulted by the sound of a loud, plummy English accent. "I don't care what you think you own," the voice was saying. "The documents I've found prove beyond any doubt that half the properties in this godforsaken village are held on fraudulent deeds. When my report goes to the authorities, you'll all be out on your ears." Hamish's eyes adjusted to the light and he took in the scene. The speaker was a man in his early 50s, dressed in an expensive cashmere overcoat and polished brogues that had no business on a Highland street in February. He had the pink, well-fed face of a man who'd never missed a meal, and the arrogant bearing of someone who believed the world owed him deference. Around him, the villagers stood in tight, furious clusters. Archie McLean, the fisherman, had his hands balled into fists. Dr. Brodie's usually mild face was flushed with anger. Even the Curry sisters, Nessie and Jessie, were quivering with indignation. "And who might you be?" Hamish asked mildly, though his Highland accent had taken on the soft, dangerous burr that those who knew him well recognised as a warning sign. The man turned and looked Hamish up and down with undisguised contempt. "Julian Vane," he said. "Corporate auditor from London, and you must be the local plod. Constable, is it? Well, you'd better prepare yourself for a busy few weeks. I've uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in the property records at your little heritage centre, and I intend to see justice done." "Is that so?" Hamish said. "Indeed it is. I have letters, original documents dating back over a century, that prove the current occupants of at least a dozen properties have no legal claim whatsoever. Secret letters, if you will, hidden away in the archives. The families have been living on stolen land for generations." A roar of protest went up from the assembled villagers. That's nonsense, shouted Archie. My family's been in our cottage for 200 years. Then your family's been squatting for 200 years, Vane said with a nasty smile. I suggest you start packing. Hamish saw Archie lunge forward and quickly step between them. Now then, he said, I think we all need to calm down. I will not calm down, Archie said, his weathered face purple with rage. This English bastard comes up here with his fancy words and his threats, and you expect us to just take it? I expect you not to assault anyone, Hamish said firmly. Mr. Vane, perhaps you'd like to show me these documents you're talking about? In due course, Constable. I'm still cataloguing them. But I can assure you they're quite authentic. Tomorrow I'll be presenting my preliminary findings to the Heritage Board. A soft voice cut through the tension. Gentlemen, please. This isn't helping anyone. Hamish turned to see Mrs. Moira Stewart, the village schoolteacher, emerging from the corner where she'd been sitting quietly with a pot of tea. She was a small, neat woman in her late 40s, with grey-streaked brown hair pulled back in a bun, and the kind of gentle, motherly demeanour that made the village children adore her. Mr. Vane, she said in her soft, soothing voice, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. I'm the village historian, and I've gone through those archives many times. Perhaps if you showed me what you found, we could clear this up. Vane looked at her and laughed, a harsh, barking sound. My dear woman, I hardly think someone who organises bake sales and teaches children their ABCs is qualified to understand complex legal documents. No, I'll present my findings to proper authorities, not village amateurs. Moira flushed but kept her composure. Of course, Mr. Vane. I just thought I might help. Can I at least get you some tea? You must be cold after your journey. I suppose that would be acceptable, Vane said ungraciously. As Moira moved toward the bar to fetch another cup, Hamish watched the villagers slowly disperse, muttering darkly amongst themselves. He had a bad feeling about this Julian Vane. The man had the look of someone who enjoyed causing pain, who took pleasure in other people's distress, and in Hamish's experience, people like that tended to come to bad ends. Later that evening, after he'd managed to clear the pub and send everyone home, Hamish returned to his station to find a basket on his doorstep. Inside were fresh scones, still warm, wrapped in a clean tea towel. A note in Moira Stewart's neat handwriting read, Thank you for keeping the peace, Hamish. I know the cold gets into your bones on nights like this. M.S. Hamish smiled and carried the basket inside. Moira was one of the few truly kind souls in Lochdubh, always thinking of others, always trying to help. He shared a scone with Lugs and Sonsi, fed the peat fire, and tried to ignore the persistent feeling that the fog had indeed brought trouble to his quiet village. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, Julian Vane was sleeping soundly in his bed at the Tommel Castle Hotel, utterly unaware that he had less than 12 hours to live. Chapter 2. Death in the Locked Archives. Hamish Macbeth was dreaming of a promotion to Strathbane when the telephone shrilled him awake at 6 a.m. In his dream, he'd been trapped in a grey office building, drowning in paperwork while Detective Chief Inspector Blair shouted at him about procedure. He woke with a gasp of relief, then groaned when he realised the phone was still ringing. Lugs lifted his odd-coloured eyes and gave Hamish a reproachful look, as if to say that decent dogs should not be disturbed at such an hour. Macbeth, Hamish mumbled into the receiver. Hamish, you'd better come quick. It was Matthew Campbell who ran the Heritage Centre. His voice was shaking. There's been... Oh God, Hamish, he's dead. Julian Vane is dead. Hamish was suddenly wide awake. Where are you? At the Heritage Centre. In the archives. The door was locked, Hamish. Locked from the inside. I had to get the spare key from the board, and when I opened it, there's blood everywhere. Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Hamish threw on his uniform, his mind already racing. He grabbed his mobile and rang Jimmy Anderson, Detective Inspector Anderson of the Strathbane Police, who was the closest thing Hamish had to a friend on the force. Jimmy, we've got a body in Lochdubh. You'd better get down here before Blair finds out. There was a groan on the other end. Too late, Hamish. He's standing right here. He heard everything. We'll be there within the hour. Hamish swore under his breath. Blair would descend on Lochdubh like a plague of locusts, bullying the locals and making a hash of the investigation in his eagerness to make a high-profile arrest. The Heritage Centre sat on a small rise overlooking the loch, a solid Victorian building of grey stone that had once been the grandest house in the village. Matthew Campbell was waiting outside, his face the colour of old porridge. "I didn't touch anything, Hamish. Just opened the door and saw him lying there, and I ran straight out and called you." "You did well, Matthew. Now let me have a look." The archives were housed in what had once been the library of the old house, a long room with tall windows and shelves reaching to the ceiling. The heavy oak door stood open, and Hamish could see the iron bolt on the inside designed to protect the valuable documents and artefacts from theft. Julian Vane lay on his back in the centre of the room, his expensive overcoat spread around him like wings. His head was misshapen, crushed on one side, and a pool of dark blood had spread across the polished wood floor. Beside him lay a massive cast-iron book press, an antique piece that had been part of the historical display, now stained with blood and hair. Hamish knelt carefully, avoiding the blood, and examined the scene. Vane's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. His pockets had been turned inside out, and papers were scattered across the floor. The door had been bolted from the inside. The windows were closed and latched. There was no other way out of the room. Hamish stood and surveyed the space, his mind working through the puzzle. Someone had killed Julian Vane, struck him down with that heavy press, and then somehow escaped from a locked room. It was the sort of problem that would have delighted the writers of detective novels, but Hamish found it merely irritating. He heard vehicles pulling up outside and sighed. Blair had made good time. Detective Chief Inspector Blair was a fat, red-faced man who had clawed his way up through the ranks by taking credit for other people's work and never letting the truth get in the way of a good arrest. He came puffing into the archives, took one look at the body and grinned like a shark scenting blood. "Right then," he said. "Locked room, is it? That means it was someone with a key. Matthew, who else has access?" "Just me and Moira Stewart," Matthew said nervously. "She's the historian. She catalogues the collections." "Then we'll be wanting to speak with Mrs. Stewart," Blair said. "And I want every local who had words with this man brought in for questioning. Hamish, you'll have made a list, I suppose?" "I was just about to start," Hamish said mildly. "Typical," Blair sneered. "Too lazy to do proper police work. We'll stand aside and let the real detectives handle this." Hamish stood aside and let Blair and his team from Strathbane swarm over the crime scene like ants at a picnic. He watched them photograph the body, dust for fingerprints, and bag the book press as evidence. Jimmy Anderson caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic shrug. The police surgeon, a dour man named Dr. MacLeod, examined the body and pronounced what was already obvious. Skull crushed by a heavy blow. Death would have been instantaneous. Time of death: I'd estimate between midnight and 2 in the morning. "Murdered," Blair said with satisfaction. "Right, Hamish, I want statements from everyone who was in that pub last night when Vane was shooting his mouth off, and I want them now." A soft voice interrupted from the doorway. "Inspector Blair? I've brought coffee for you and your men. I thought you might need it. Coming all the way from Strathbane in this cold." Moira Stewart stood there with a large thermos and a stack of cups, looking small and concerned. She'd wrapped a thick cardigan over her usual neat blouse and skirt, and her eyes were red as if she'd been crying. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Stewart," Blair said, his tone considerably warmer than it had been with Hamish. "Very thoughtful indeed." "It's the least I could do," Moira said quietly. "Poor Mr. Vane. I know he wasn't well liked, but no one deserves this. I've been racking my brain trying to think who might have done such a terrible thing." "You knew him well, did you?" Blair asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "Only from yesterday, but I did prepare this for you." She handed Blair a neatly typed list. Everyone Mr. Vane spoke to at the pub, and what was said. I thought it might help. Blair scanned the list and his grin widened. "Very helpful, Mrs. Stewart. Very helpful indeed. I see that Archie McLean threatened to knock Vane's teeth down his throat." "Archie was drunk," Hamish interjected. He didn't mean anything by it. That's for me to determine, Blair snapped. Mrs. Stewart, can you account for your movements last night? Moira nodded. I went home after the pub closed. I live alone in the old schoolhouse cottage. So I'm afraid I have no one to verify that. I read for a while and went to bed around 11. And you have a key to these archives? Yes, for my historical research. But I haven't been here in over a week. I've been preparing lessons for the children. We'll need to verify that, Blair said, and I'll want a list of everyone else who might have had access. Of course, I'll help in any way I can. Hamish watched Moira carefully. She seemed genuinely distressed, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee for the forensics team. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a kind, helpful woman doing her best to assist the police. But something nagged at him, a small inconsistency he couldn't quite place. Blair was organising his troops, assigning officers to interview the villagers. I want Archie McLean brought in first. Then that doctor, Brodie, anyone who had a crossword with the victim. We'll have this wrapped up by tea time. You might want to consider how the killer got out of a locked room, Hamish suggested. Blair waved a dismissive hand. Secret passage or some such nonsense. These old houses are full of them. We'll find it. Hamish doubted that very much. He'd grown up in these parts and knew the Heritage Centre had been thoroughly renovated in the 1960s. If there had been secret passages, they'd been sealed up long ago. As Blair bustled about, making a great show of taking charge, Hamish slipped away to examine the door more carefully. The bolt was solid iron, recently oiled. There were no scratches or marks to suggest it had been forced. The windows were similarly secure, their old-fashioned latches firmly in place, and he stepped outside and walked around the building. The morning mist was lifting, revealing the loch in all its silver glory. At the back of the Heritage Centre, near the old servants' entrance, he noticed fresh boot prints in the mud. Large ones, probably a man's. Find something? Jimmy Anderson had followed him out. Maybe. Those prints weren't there yesterday. Jimmy squinted at them. Could be anyone's. Could be from days ago. The rain 2 days ago would have washed them away. Point taken. I'll get the lads to make casts. But Hamish, between you and me, Blair's got the bit between his teeth on this one. He wants a quick arrest, and he's not fussy about who. I gathered that. Watch yourself. You know how he gets when he thinks you're showing him up. Hamish nodded grimly. Blair's hatred of him was legendary, and born of the simple fact that Hamish regularly solved cases Blair couldn't crack. But Hamish had no ambition for promotion or glory. He just wanted justice done, and his village left in peace. As he walked back to his Land Rover, Moira Stewart caught up with him. Hamish, I wonder if I might have a word. Of course, Moira. I know this sounds silly, but I keep thinking about those letters Mr. Vane mentioned, the secret ones. I've been through those archives dozens of times, and I've never seen anything like what he described. What are you thinking? Well, there are stories, old stories, about Jacobite gold being hidden somewhere in Lochdubh during the uprising. Some say there are letters that tell where it's buried. Do you think someone might have killed Mr. Vane to get those letters? A thief, perhaps, from outside the village? It was a reasonable theory, Hamish supposed, but something about it rang false. Still, he thanked Moira for her suggestion and promised to look into it. As he drove back to the station, his mind worried at the problem like lugs with a bone. A locked room, a hated man, and a helpful schoolteacher who seemed just a touch too eager to point the investigation away from the village. It was going to be a long day. Chapter 3. Sifting. The Highland Gossip. The Curry sisters lived in a neat whitewashed cottage on the edge of the village, where they could keep watch on the comings and goings of their neighbours with the dedication of a pair of lighthouse keepers. Hamish knocked on their door at precisely 9 o'clock, knowing that any earlier would find them at their morning prayers, and any later would interrupt their tea. Nessie Curry opened the door, her sharp eyes gleaming with excitement behind her spectacles. "It's Hamish," she called over her shoulder. "Hamish," echoed her twin sister Jessie, who had the peculiar habit of repeating the last few words of everything Nessie said. Come in, We've been expecting you." "Expecting you," Jessie confirmed. The cottage smelled of lavender furniture polish and baking. The sisters settled Hamish in their spotless parlour and presented him with tea and a slice of Dundee cake that could have won prizes at the Highland Show. "Terrible business about Mr. Vane," Nessie said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Terrible business," Jessie agreed. "I don't suppose either of you saw anything unusual yesterday afternoon or evening?" Hamish asked, pulling out his notebook. Nessie leaned forward conspiratorially. "As a matter of fact, we did. We saw Mr. Vane having a fierce argument with a young man down by the harbour. About 4 o'clock it was." "4 o'clock," Jessie repeated. "Can you describe this young man?" "Tall, dark-haired, wearing one of those expensive jackets the young people favour. Not from the village." "Not from the village. And what were they arguing about?" Nessie pursed her lips. "We couldn't hear the exact words, you understand, but it was very heated." The young man kept pointing his finger at Mr. Vane, and Mr. Vane was laughing at him. Not a nice laugh either. "Not nice at all," Hamish made notes. A mysterious stranger arguing with the victim hours before his death was exactly the sort of lead Blair would seize upon, probably to the exclusion of all common sense. "Did you see where this young man went afterwards?" "He walked off toward the Tommel Castle Hotel." "Tommel Castle Hotel? And Mr. Vane?" "He went into the Heritage Centre. We saw the lights on in the archives until quite late." "Until quite late," Jessie echoed solemnly. Hamish finished his tea and thanked the sisters. As he was leaving, Nessie caught his arm. "Hamish, that awful Inspector Blair was here earlier, shouting at poor Archie McLean outside his cottage. You won't let him arrest innocent people, will you?" "Not if I can help it, Nessie." From the Curry sisters, Hamish drove to the caravan park where Angus MacDonald lived in a decrepit mobile home that should have been condemned years ago. Angus was the village seer, a wizened old man with a biblical beard who claimed to have the second sight and charged tourists a tenner to have their fortunes told. Hamish had long ago concluded that Angus was a fraud, but a useful one. The old man had a network of informants that would have made the KGB jealous, and he heard every scrap of gossip in a 50-mile radius. "I've been expecting you, Hamish Macbeth," Angus said as Hamish approached. Oh, he was sitting outside his caravan on a folding chair, smoking his pipe and looking mystical. "I'm sure you have, Angus. What with the murder being the talk of every pub from here to Inverness," Angus cackled. "Aye, well, the spirits told me you'd be wanting information. The spirits or Mrs. McBean from the post office. A seer never reveals his sources, but I can tell you this, Hamish. That Englishman was a nasty piece of work. He came to see me, wanted to know about the old families of Lochdubh, asked questions about property and land ownership going back generations. What did you tell him?" "Nothing he didn't already know, but I'll tell you something interesting. He was particularly interested in the old Sinclair family." "The Sinclairs? They've been gone from Lochdubh for 40 years or more." "Aye, but they owned the big house, the one that's now the Heritage Centre. Lost everything in some business scandal back in the 80s. The daughter went away to London, and the father killed himself. Sad business." Hamish filed this information away. "Did Vane say why he was interested?" "Not to me. But he had a look about him, like a cat that's found the cream. Whatever he'd discovered, he was pleased about it." After leaving Angus, Hamish stopped at the Lochdubh Arms, where he found Archie McLean nursing a whisky and looking like a man who'd had a very bad morning. "Blair had me down at the station for 2 hours, Archie said bitterly, treating me like a criminal, asking the same questions over and over. Where was I? Did I threaten Vane? When was the last time I cleaned my boots?" "Your boots?" "Aye. Apparently they found boot prints at the Heritage Centre, and Blair's convinced they're mine. Never mind that half the men in Lochdubh wear the same size Wellingtons." Hamish sighed. Blair was building a case against Archie with the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. "Where were you last night, Archie? And don't tell me you were home, because we both know your wife would mention it if you'd been there." Archie had the grace to look sheepish. "I was hiding in the cellar here. Ian lets me kip down there sometimes when things get too loud at home. I was there from about 9 until I left this morning at 6. Can Ian confirm that? Aye, he brought me down a blanket and a dram around 10 o'clock. That was something, at least. Hamish made a mental note to get a formal statement from Ian, the publican. By early afternoon, Hamish had compiled a depressingly long list of people who'd had reason to dislike Julian Vane. The man had insulted half the village and threatened the other half. But disliking someone wasn't the same as crushing their skull with a book press. He needed access to the official forensic reports and autopsy findings, which meant appealing to Jimmy Anderson's better nature. Fortunately, Jimmy's better nature could be reliably accessed through the medium of good whiskey. Hamish stopped at his station long enough to retrieve a bottle of 15-year-old Talisker from his private stock, then drove to Strathbane. He found Jimmy in his office, buried under paperwork and looking harassed. "Hamish," Jimmy said with relief, "please tell me you've brought something stronger than tea." Hamish produced the bottle with a flourish. "God bless you." "Ah, man, Blair's been on the rampage all day. He's convinced Archie McLean is good for it and wants to charge him tomorrow." "On what evidence?" "The boot prints and the threats from the pub. It's thin, I know, but Blair's under pressure from headquarters to get a result." "What does the autopsy say?" Jimmy poured 2 generous measures and slid the file across the desk. "Off the record, mind. If Blair finds out I showed you this, he'll have my head." Hamish scanned the report. Death by blunt force trauma. Single blow delivered with considerable force. Time of death between midnight and 2 in the morning. No defensive wounds, suggesting Vane had been taken by surprise. "What about fingerprints?" "Hundreds of them. It's a public building. We've got Vane's prints on everything, plus Matthew Campbell's, Moira Stewart's, and about 2 dozen others we're still trying to identify." "Anything else?" Jimmy leaned back in his chair. "This is the interesting bit. The forensics team found traces of chalk dust near the body. Coloured chalk, the kind teachers use." Hamish felt a small chill run down his spine. "That could be from anywhere. The building's used for school trips." "Aye, but there was also a scrap of old wallpaper clutched in Vane's hand. Victorian era, according to the experts. Floral pattern. The Heritage Centre's been renovated. There's no Victorian wallpaper on display." "Exactly. So where did it come from?" Hamish sipped his whiskey thoughtfully. The chalk dust could be explained away, but the wallpaper was odd. Very odd indeed. "Has Blair seen this?" He glanced at it and dismissed it as irrelevant. He's too focused on Archie to consider other leads, which meant it was up to Hamish to follow those leads himself. He finished his drink, thanked Jimmy for his help, and drove back to Lochdubh as the winter sun began to set over the loch. He had a locked room, a hidden piece of wallpaper and chalk dust. It wasn't much, but it was more than Blair had, and infinitely more interesting than a pair of muddy Wellingtons. Hamish fed lugs and Sonsey, then sat by the fire with his notebook, going over everything he'd learned. The mysterious young man by the harbour, the Sinclair family connection, the chalk and wallpaper. And through it all, Moira Stewart, helpful and kind, bringing coffee and making lists. Too helpful, perhaps. Hamish shook his head. He was letting the case make him suspicious of everyone. Dame Moira was exactly what she seemed. A sweet, gentle woman who wouldn't hurt a fly. But as he drifted off to sleep that night, his last thought was of how often the most dangerous people were the ones everyone trusted. Chapter 4. The Blackmailer's Ledger. Hamish woke to find Sonsey sitting on his chest staring at him with her wild amber eyes. It was her usual method of indicating that breakfast was overdue, and Hamish had learned long ago that arguing with a wildcat was an exercise in futility. He fed his animals, made himself a pot of strong tea, and was contemplating a morning of legitimate police work when his mobile rang. The final autopsy report confirms it was one blow, delivered with precision, Jimmy Anderson said without preamble. Whoever killed Vane knew exactly where to strike. Not a frenzied attack, Hamish. This was deliberate. Anyone could get lucky with a heavy object. Aye, but the angle suggests someone who knew what they were doing. And there's something else. Toxicology came back clean. But we found something in his jacket pocket. A key. To the archives. No, smaller. Looks like a safe key, brass, old-fashioned, the kind you'd use for a private strongbox. After Jimmy rang off, Hamish sat drumming his fingers on the kitchen table. A safe key suggested Vane had been hiding something valuable. The question was where. He drove to the Heritage Centre, where the yellow police tape still fluttered in the morning breeze. Matthew Campbell was inside, looking exhausted. "They finished with the crime scene," Matthew said. "Blair says I can clean up the blood tomorrow, as if I could ever use that room again without seeing poor Mr. Vane lying there." "Matthew, is there a safe in the archives?" "Not that I know of. Why?" "Just a thought. Would you mind if I had another look around?" Matthew waved him through tiredly. "Oh, help yourself. Just don't move anything Blair hasn't already trampled over." The archives still smelled of blood and death beneath the overlay of fingerprint powder. Hamish ignored the chalked outline on the floor and began a systematic search of the room. Victorian buildings often had hidden spaces, places where the original owners had concealed valuables from servants or thieves. He ran his hands along the bookshelves, testing for false backs. He examined the wainscoting for loose panels. He was beginning to think the safe, if it existed, was somewhere else entirely when his fingers found a slight irregularity in one of the shelf supports. A book with a dark green spine, its title too faded to read. Hamish pulled it, and it came away in his hand, revealing a small cavity behind. Inside was a metal safe, its door painted to match the wood. The brass key from Vane's pocket fit perfectly. Inside the safe was a leather-bound ledger and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Hamish carefully photographed everything with his phone before removing them, mindful that he was probably breaking half a dozen police procedures. He took the ledger to Matthew's office and began to read. What he found made his blood run cold. Julian Vane hadn't been a simple auditor. He'd been a blackmailer, and a sophisticated one at that. The ledger detailed a system that was almost elegant in its cruelty. Vane would research property deeds, looking for irregularities, gaps in documentation, or forgotten legal complications. Then he'd approach the property owners and offer to make the problems disappear for a fee. Those who refused found themselves threatened with exposure, legal action, and ruin. The ledger listed a dozen names from Lochdubh alone. Archie McLean, who'd inherited his cottage from an uncle whose will was never properly probated. Dr. Brodie, whose surgery sat on land transferred through a deed that lacked a crucial signature. Even the Curry sisters, whose cottage had been in their family for generations, but whose original land grant had apparently been issued under a name that wasn't quite their own. None of these irregularities would have mattered in the normal course of events. Highland property ownership was a tangled web of tradition, verbal agreements, and paperwork that had been mouldering in archives for centuries. But in the hands of a ruthless man with legal knowledge, they became weapons. Vane had been systematically extorting the village, forcing people to sell their properties to him at a fraction of their value, or pay him to keep quiet. Hamish felt a surge of anger. No wonder someone had killed the man. The only surprise was that they'd waited this long. He was photographing the final pages when he heard footsteps in the hallway. He quickly returned the ledger to the safe and pocketed the key. Moira Stewart appeared in the doorway, carrying a basket covered with a checked cloth. "Hamish, I thought you might be here. I brought you some lunch. You must be working so hard on this dreadful case." "That's very thoughtful of you, Moira." She set the basket on the desk and peered at him with concern. "You look troubled. Have you discovered something?" Hamish hesitated. The ledger was evidence. But it was also explosive. If word got out about what Vane had been doing, half the village would be under suspicion. "Just following up on some details," he said carefully. "I've been thinking about those secret letters Mr. Vane mentioned," Moira said, settling into a chair. "You know, there's a book in the archives about Highland history that has a detailed map of this building from when it was a private residence. If someone wanted to search for hidden passages or secret rooms, that's where they'd look. Is that so?" "Oh, yes. It's called The Great Houses of Sutherland. A red leather binding kept in the reference section. I've used it many times for my research." She stood and went to the shelf, running her finger along the spines until she found what she was looking for. "Here it is. You see, there's a complete floor plan from 1867. Hamish examined the book. Sure enough, there were detailed architectural drawings of the building, including rooms that no longer existed and passages that had been sealed up during the renovations. This is very helpful, Moira. I'm glad I could assist. She smiled at him, her gentle face creasing with warmth. We're all so grateful you're looking into this properly, Hamish. Inspector Blair seems determined to arrest poor Archie, but we all know he couldn't hurt anyone. After Moira left, Hamish unwrapped the basket to find fresh sandwiches, a flask of hot soup and a slice of gingerbread. He ate while studying the architectural plans, noting that there had indeed been a servants' staircase that once connected the archives to the floor above. But something nagged at him. Moira had known exactly where to find the book, had brought it to his attention with perfect timing. Was she genuinely being helpful, or was she steering the investigation in a particular direction? He thought about the mysterious young man the Curry sisters had seen, a stranger arguing with Vane by the harbour. Perhaps that was worth pursuing. Hamish drove to the Tommel Castle Hotel, where the manager confirmed that a young man matching the description had indeed stayed there 2 nights ago. His name was Callum Vane, and he'd given an Edinburgh address. Julian Vane's nephew, the manager explained. He arrived the day before the murder, asking after his uncle. Seemed upset about something. Is he still here? Left first thing yesterday morning before we'd even heard about the murder. Checked out at 6 and drove off in a hurry. Hamish obtained Callum Vane's details and rang Jimmy Anderson. Run a check on Callum Vane, Edinburgh. I need to know if he was in the area the night of the murder. While he waited for Jimmy to call back, Hamish returned to the police station and spread out the photographs he'd taken of the ledger. The level of detail was staggering. Vane had done his research thoroughly, uncovering secrets that went back decades. One entry caught his attention. It was dated just 3 days before the murder, and it mentioned the Sinclair family. Vane had noted that he'd discovered conclusive evidence about the original ownership of the Heritage Centre, and that this information would be particularly profitable. Hamish remembered what Angus had said about the Sinclairs. The family had lost everything in a business scandal, and their daughter had gone to London. The father had killed himself. Could there be a connection? His mobile rang. It was Jimmy. Interesting news about Callum Vane. He's got gambling debts up to his eyeballs, and he's been pressing his uncle for money. We pulled traffic camera footage from the A9. His car was recorded heading south at 11:45 the night of the murder near Inverness. No way he could have been in Lochdubh at midnight. Another suspect eliminated. Hamish thanked Jimmy and hung up, feeling the case shift and reform in his mind like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together yet. He had a victim who was a blackmailer. He had boot prints that pointed to Archie. He had a mysterious piece of wallpaper and chalk dust. And he had Moira Stewart, always helpful, always present, always ready with suggestions. Outside, the winter afternoon was fading to dusk. Hamish looked out at the loch, at the mountains beyond, at the village he loved and was sworn to protect. Someone in Lochdubh had killed Julian Vane, and Hamish was beginning to suspect that the killer was far cleverer than anyone had imagined. Chapter 5. Expanding the suspect pool. The next morning brought sleet that rattled against the windows like thrown gravel. Hamish stood at his kitchen sink watching the grey curtain of weather sweep across the loch and tried to make sense of what he knew. 3 people stood out from Vane's blackmail ledger as having particularly strong motives. Archie McLean, whose whiskey fund would be exposed if his wife learned about the cottage inheritance issue. Dr. Brodie, facing professional ruin if Vane revealed his past medical mistake. And now Callum Vane, the debt-ridden nephew who'd been seen arguing with his uncle hours before the murder. The trouble was, all 3 had reasonable explanations or alibis. Hamish needed to verify them properly, which meant talking to people who had no interest in talking to the police. He started with Archie's wife, a formidable woman named Morag who kept her cottage so spotless that visitors were expected to remove their shoes at the door. She answered Hamish's knock with a suspicious glare. "If you're here about Archie, I've already told that awful Inspector Blair everything I know. Which is what exactly, Morag? She sniffed. That my husband wasn't home Tuesday night. Said he was helping Ian with stock-taking at the pub. Stock-taking at midnight, if you please. As if I was born yesterday. And you didn't go looking for him? I've learned it's better not to know where Archie goes when he's avoiding me. But I'll tell you this, Hamish Macbeth. My husband's a coward and a layabout, but he's not a murderer. He can barely kill a fish without apologising to it first. Hamish tended to agree. Archie's idea of confrontation was hiding in a cellar with a bottle. Still, Blair had seized on the boot prints as damning evidence, and without a solid alibi, Archie remained the prime suspect. From the McLean cottage, Hamish walked through the sleeting rain to Dr. Brodie's surgery. The doctor was in his consulting room writing up patient notes, and he looked up with visible anxiety when Hamish entered. "I've been expecting you," Dr. Brodie said. "Blair's already been here, asking about that business with Mrs. Ferguson's prescription 3 years ago. The one Vane was threatening to report to the medical board?" "Aye." Brodie rubbed his face tiredly. "It was a genuine mistake, Hamish. I transposed 2 numbers on a dosage and Mrs. Ferguson had a bad reaction. She recovered fully, thank God. Nay, but the board could still strike me off if they thought I'd been negligent. Vane found out about it. He had copies of her medical records, God knows how. Told me I could pay him £5,000 or he'd make sure the board launched a full investigation. Did you pay him?" "I was going to. I'd arranged to meet him Wednesday morning to hand over the money. But then he turned up dead, and now Blair thinks I killed him to avoid paying." "Where were you Tuesday night?" "Playing cards with Reverend Wellington at the manse. We had our weekly game. Started at 8, finished just after midnight. The Reverend will confirm it." Hamish made a note. Wellington was many things, but he wasn't a liar. If he said Brodie was with him, it was the truth. "What about the young man who was arguing with Vane at the harbour?" Callum Vane?" "Never saw him. But I heard he was Julian's nephew. Family resemblance in the sense of being thoroughly unpleasant, I'd imagine." Hamish left the surgery and drove through the worsening weather to Strathbane, where he found Jimmy Anderson in the incident room, surrounded by photographs and evidence bags. "Tell me you've got something," Jimmy said. "Blair's scheduled a press conference for this afternoon. He's going to announce Archie's arrest." "On what grounds?" "The boot prints, the public threats, and what Blair calls suspicious behaviour. He's also claiming that Archie had access to the Heritage Centre, because his cousin used to work there 15 years ago. It's thin, Hamish. But Blair's convinced. And that's all that matters to him." "What about Callum Vane?" Jimmy pulled up the traffic camera footage on his computer. "See for yourself. That's his car on the A9 at 11:45 heading south. There's another camera in Inverness that clocks him at midnight, and a third near Perth at 2 in the morning. He was driving straight through to Edinburgh. No stops. So he's definitely out. Unless he hired someone, which seems unlikely given that he's broke. But here's the interesting thing." Jimmy handed Hamish a printed email. "I did some digging into Callum's background. Turns out he'd been pestering his uncle for months about his inheritance. Julian had promised him money years ago, but never delivered. The argument at the harbour was Callum demanding what he thought he was owed, and Vane refused? According to the hotel manager who overheard part of it, Vane laughed in his face and said he'd already spent Callum's inheritance on property investments. Callum threatened to contest the will, and Vane told him to go ahead and try. Hamish absorbed this. Another motive, another suspect cleared by an ironclad alibi. "What about the ledger I found?" Jimmy lowered his voice. "I showed it to Blair. He said it was irrelevant to the case and not to waste time on it. Between you and me, I think he's worried that if we start investigating the blackmail angle, half the village becomes suspects and his nice, simple case against Archie falls apart. That's exactly what should happen. Aye, but you know Blair. He'd rather arrest the wrong man than admit he doesn't know what he's doing." Hamish drove back to Lochdubh feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He had 3 strong suspects, all with clear motives and all with alibis that seemed solid. Unless one of them was lying, or unless he'd missed something crucial, the killer was still out there. He stopped at the Lochdubh Arms, where Ian the publican confirmed that Archie had indeed been hiding in the cellar Tuesday night. "Came down about 9, said Morag was in one of her moods. "I gave him a blanket and let him kip on the old sofa. He was still there when I locked up at midnight." "You're certain about the time?" "Positive. I always lock up dead on midnight. Licensing laws, you know." "Did you check on him after that?" Ian shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no. But the cellar door locks from the outside, and I had the only key. He couldn't have got out even if he'd wanted to. Unless someone let him out," Hamish thought. But Ian had no reason to help Archie commit murder, and the timeline was impossibly tight. Archie would have had to get from the pub to the Heritage Centre, kill Vane, somehow escape from the locked archives and return to the cellar, all while blind drunk. It was possible, but only just. Hamish sat in his Land Rover outside the pub and watched the sleet turn to snow. Big, wet flakes that stuck to the windscreen and blurred the world beyond. Someone in this village had planned a murder with cold precision. They'd known about the hidden safe, about Vane's blackmail operation, about the layout of the Heritage Centre. They'd struck with enough force to kill instantly. Salt then vanished from a locked room like smoke, and they'd done it while making sure everyone else looked guilty. His mobile rang. It was Moira Stewart. "Hamish, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I've found something. A note pushed under my door at the schoolhouse. It's a threat written in Archie's handwriting. I think you should see it." Hamish's instincts prickled. "I'll be right there." The schoolhouse cottage sat at the edge of the village, a neat stone building with a garden that even in winter looked well tended. Moira met him at the door, her face pale and worried. "I found it this morning when I came back from the shops. Look." She handed him a crumpled piece of paper. The handwriting was crude and shaky, clearly written by someone either very drunk or trying to disguise their hand. It read, "Keep your mouth shut about what you know or you'll end up like Vane." "This is Archie's writing?" Hamish asked. "I think so. I've seen his signature on school forms. But Hamish, why would Archie threaten me? I've been trying to help the investigation." "What do you know that Archie would want kept quiet?" Moira twisted her hands together. "I've been thinking, and I wonder if perhaps I saw something Tuesday night. I couldn't sleep, and I went for a walk around 11. I thought I saw someone near the Heritage Centre, but it was foggy and I couldn't be sure. What if it was Archie, and he knows I saw him?" Hamish studied the note carefully. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. But he couldn't prove it was a forgery, and if it was genuine, it suggested Archie was more desperate than anyone had realised. "I'll look into it," he said. "In the meantime, keep your doors locked." As he drove away, Hamish felt the case tilting in a new direction. The helpful schoolteacher, the perfectly discovered note, the timely recollection of a midnight walk. Moira Stewart was either the unluckiest woman in Lochdubh, or she was playing a very dangerous game. Chapter 6. False Trails and Poached Fish. Hamish spent the rest of the day trying to verify Archie's handwriting against the threatening note. The problem was that Archie, like many of the older men in Lochdubh, wrote as little as possible, preferring to conduct his business through nods, grunts, and the occasional verbal agreement sealed with a handshake. The few examples Hamish could find, a signature on a fishing licence, a scrawled shopping list Morag had kept, were inconclusive. They might match the note, or they might not. A handwriting expert could tell the difference, but that would mean showing the note to Blair, and Hamish wasn't ready to do that yet. He was sitting in his office, comparing the samples for the third time, when Luggs suddenly lifted his head and growled, a low rumble that meant someone was approaching. A moment later there was a furtive knock at the back door. Hamish opened it to find Dr. Brodie standing in the shadows, looking like a man with something heavy on his conscience. "Can I come in? I don't want to be seen." Hamish ushered him into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Whatever Brodie had to say, it would go down easier with tea. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you," Brodie began, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "About Tuesday night." Hamish's heart sank. "You weren't playing cards with Reverend Wellington?" "No, I was. But I left earlier than I said. We finished our game at 11:30, not midnight. I lied because I didn't want you asking what I did after. And what did you do? Brodie looked thoroughly miserable. I went to the Heritage Centre. I was going to break in and find Vane's evidence about the prescription error. Destroy it before he could use it. But when I got there, the lights were on in the archives, and I could see Vane moving about, so I left, came straight home. What time was this? 11:45, maybe. I was only there for a few minutes. Did you see anyone else? No. The fog was thick as porridge. I could barely see my hand in front of my face. Hamish poured the tea and considered this new information. If Brodie was telling the truth, he'd been near the Heritage Centre around the time of the murder, but he'd also had the sense not to confront an armed blackmailer in the middle of the night, which suggested a level of self-preservation inconsistent with murder. Why are you telling me this now? Because I saw someone else on my way home. Someone carrying something heavy wrapped in burlap. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now I keep wondering if it was connected to Vane's death. Could you identify this person? No, like I said, the fog was terrible, but they were moving quickly, heading toward the old fish sheds by the harbour. After Brodie left, Hamish sat staring at the remains of his tea. A mysterious figure with a heavy bundle heading for the fish sheds. It could be anything: smuggled whiskey, illegal salmon, or something more sinister. There was only one way to find out. The fish sheds were a collection of ramshackle buildings at the far end of the harbour, used for storing nets and equipment. Most were locked and abandoned, but a few were still in use by the local fishermen. Hamish arrived just before midnight, his reasoning that if someone was hiding something illegal, they'd check on it after dark. He positioned himself behind a stack of old lobster pots and waited. The wind off the loch was bitter, and he was beginning to regret his decision when he saw a figure emerge from the shadows, moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be observed. Dr. Brodie. Hamish watched as the doctor unlocked one of the smaller sheds and slipped inside. A moment later, light flickered through the cracks in the weathered boards. Hamish gave him 5 minutes, then pushed open the shed door. Brodie spun around, holding a spade, his face white with shock. "Hamish, I can explain." "I hope so, because this looks very suspicious." The shed's earthen floor had been recently disturbed. Fresh soil was mounded in one corner, and beside it sat a burlap sack stained with what looked like blood. "It's not what you think," Brodie said desperately. "Then what is it?" Brodie set down the spade and opened the sack. Inside was a massive salmon, easily 20 pounds, its silver scales gleaming in the lamplight. "I poached it from the Laird stretch of the river, Tuesday afternoon before all this business with Vane started. It's for my wife's birthday. She loves fresh salmon, and I thought, well, I know it was wrong, but I've been doing it for years and no one's ever complained." Hamish looked at the fish, at the blood-stained sack, at Brodie's anguished face, and felt the tension drain out of him. This wasn't murder evidence. This was a Highland tradition as old as the hills themselves. "You were burying it?" "I panicked when you started asking questions. Thought if you searched my house you'd find it. So I moved it here, planning to bury it until things calmed down. But then I realised that looked even more suspicious, so I came back to dig it up and take it home." It was exactly the sort of complicated, irrational thinking that characterised innocent people under pressure. Guilty men didn't bury salmon at midnight. Hamish sighed. "You're a bloody fool, Andrew Brodie." "I know. The penalty for poaching on the Laird's land is a fine and possibly jail time." "I know," Brodie repeated miserably. "But seeing as I've got a murder to solve and the Laird's a pompous arse who has more salmon than he knows what to do with, I'm going to pretend I never saw this. Take your fish home, give it to your wife. And for God's sake, stop doing stupid things in the middle of murder investigations." The relief on Brodie's face was almost comical. "Thank you, Hamish. I swear I'll never poach again." Well, just remember that when it comes time for my annual physical, I expect to be declared fit as a fiddle, no matter what the scales say." As Hamish walked back through the village, he reflected on the peculiar nature of Highland justice. In Glasgow or Edinburgh, he'd have arrested Brodie without a second thought. but Lochdubh ran on different rules, older rules, where a man's character mattered more than the letter of the law. Still, the incident had wasted valuable time. Blair's press conference was tomorrow, and Hamish was no closer to proving Archie's innocence or identifying the real killer. He was passing the schoolhouse when he noticed a light on in one of the windows. It was well past 1 in the morning. What was Moira doing up at this hour? Hamish moved closer, keeping to the shadows. Through the window he could see Moira at her desk, writing something. Her gentle, motherly demeanour was gone, replaced by a look of intense concentration that made her seem like a different person entirely. As he watched, she finished writing, folded the paper carefully, and placed it in an envelope. Then she stood, pulled on her coat and left the cottage by the back door. Hamish followed at a distance, curious to see where she was going. She walked quickly through the empty streets, her breath steaming in the cold air until she reached the Heritage Centre. Using a key from her pocket, she let herself in. 10 minutes later, she emerged and hurried back home. Hamish waited until she was safely inside before approaching the Heritage Centre. The door was locked again, but he had his own set of keys. He slipped inside and went straight to the archives. On the desk where Vane's body had been found, there was a fresh envelope addressed to Detective Chief Inspector Blair. Inside was a letter, written in the same shaky handwriting as the threatening note Moira had shown him earlier. It claimed that the writer had seen Archie McLean near the Heritage Centre at midnight on Tuesday, and had kept quiet out of fear, but could no longer live with the knowledge. Hamish stood holding the letter, his mind racing. Moira was manufacturing evidence against Archie, building a case against an innocent man with the same careful precision she used to plan her lessons. The question was why? He photographed the letter with his phone, then carefully placed it back in the envelope. Let Blair find it in the morning. In the meantime, Hamish had some serious digging to do into the past of the helpful Mrs. Moira Stewart. He drove back to his station as dawn was breaking over the loch, turning the water to molten gold. Lugs and Sonsi greeted him with reproachful looks that clearly said he should have been home hours ago. Hamish fed them, made himself a strong pot of coffee and booted up his computer. Somewhere in Moira's past was the key to this murder. He could feel it. He just had to find it before Blair arrested an innocent man and the real killer slipped away. Chapter 7. Ironclad Alibis. Hamish spent what remained of the night searching through public records, trying to find any connection between Moira Stewart and the village's past. The problem was that Moira's history appeared entirely ordinary. She'd arrived in Lochdubh 12 years ago with impeccable teaching credentials from Edinburgh, glowing references, and a gentle manner that had won over the village within a month. Before that, there were gaps, periods where she seemed to have disappeared from official records entirely. It was possible she'd been living abroad or working in the private sector, but Hamish's instincts told him the gaps meant something more. He was still at his computer when Blair's motorcade roared into the village at 8 o'clock sharp. Hamish watched from his window as the Detective Chief Inspector emerged from his car, already talking to reporters who'd somehow been tipped off about the press conference. 20 minutes later, Hamish's phone rang. "Get yourself to the Heritage Centre," Blair barked, "and bring Archie McLean. I'm making the arrest official." On what new evidence? Anonymous letter delivered this morning. Witness places Archie at the scene at the time of death. That, combined with the boot prints and motive, is more than enough. Hamish felt his jaw tighten. "I'd like to examine that letter first." "You'll examine it after I've arrested your friend. That's an order, Constable." The line went dead. Hamish found Archie at his cottage, pale and shaking, with Morag standing protectively beside him. "I didn't do it, Hamish," Archie said. "I swear on my mother's grave I was in that cellar all night." "I believe you, but Blair doesn't, and right now he's got enough to charge you. You'll need to come with me." Morag's face crumpled. "This is wrong. Everyone knows Archie couldn't hurt anyone." At the Heritage Centre, Blair was in his element, strutting before the cameras like a peacock. He'd found the anonymous letter exactly where Moira had planted it, and he was treating it as the final piece of evidence he needed. The people of Lochdubh can rest easy, Blair announced to the assembled press. Thanks to thorough police work and cooperation from the community, we've identified the killer. Archibald MacLean, you're under arrest for the murder of Julian Vane. Archie looked like he might faint. Hamish caught his arm and steadied him. Don't say anything without a solicitor, Hamish murmured. As Blair's officers led Archie away in handcuffs, Hamish caught sight of Moira Stewart standing at the edge of the crowd. She looked appropriately distressed, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. But when her gaze met Hamish's for just a moment, he saw something else. Satisfaction. After the press dispersed, Hamish cornered Jimmy Anderson. You know this is wrong. I know. But try telling Blair that. He's convinced he's got his man. The letters are fake. I saw Moira Stewart planted early this morning. Jimmy's eyebrows shot up. You can prove that. Not without revealing I was watching her, which would raise questions about why. But I know what I saw, Jimmy. Moira's framing Archie, and we need to find out why. What do you need? Time. And access to old records from the 80s. The Sinclair family scandal that Angus mentioned. I think that's the key. Jimmy nodded slowly. I'll see what I can dig up. But Hamish, Blair's filing formal charges this afternoon. If you're going to prove Archie's innocent, you'd better do it fast. Hamish drove to the Reverend Wellington's manse and found the minister in his study writing Sunday's sermon. Hamish, terrible business about Archie. I've been praying for him. I need to verify something. Dr. Brodie says he was here playing cards Tuesday night. Is that true? Absolutely. We play every Tuesday. Started at 8, as usual. Andrew left around 11:30. You're certain about the time? I am. I remember looking at the clock and thinking we'd run late. I had an early meeting Wednesday morning. Did he seem agitated, nervous? Wellington considered this. Perhaps a bit preoccupied. But then, he just learned about Mr. Vane's threats. We all were worried about what that dreadful man might do next. From the manse, Hamish returned to the Lochdubh Arms, where Ian confirmed once again that Archie had been in the cellar from 9 o'clock onward. And you locked the cellar door at midnight? Aye, same as I told you before. Archie couldn't have got out even if he'd wanted to. Could someone have unlocked it from the outside? Ian frowned. I suppose, if they had a key. But I keep the only one on my personal key ring, and I never let it out of my sight. Hamish examined the cellar door. It was solid oak with an old-fashioned iron lock. Picking it would take skill and time, and neither of which seemed plausible for a midnight murder mission. He descended into the cellar and looked around. It was exactly as he remembered from his own occasional visits. Dusty bottles, stacked crates, and an ancient sofa that sagged in the middle. There were no windows, no other exits. If Archie had been locked in here, he'd have stayed locked in. Which meant either Ian was lying, or Archie truly was innocent. Hamish trusted Ian. The publican had no reason to protect a murderer, and every reason to tell the truth. His licence depended on his reputation. Back at the station, Hamish found a message from Jimmy Anderson. He rang back immediately. I've been going through the traffic cameras, Jimmy said. Callum Vane's alibi is solid as granite. Multiple cameras tracked his car from Lochdubh to Edinburgh without stopping. He's definitely out. I never thought he did it anyway, too obvious. There's something else. I pulled the old police reports from the Sinclair bankruptcy in 1984. The family lost everything when their business partner, a London financier named Gerald Vane, was caught running a pyramid scheme. Used the Sinclairs' money to prop up his failing investments. When it all collapsed, the Sinclairs were ruined. Hamish felt a chill run down his spine. Gerald Vane. Any relation to Julian? His father. Julian inherited the whole estate when Gerald died in 1998. The Heritage Centre building was part of it. The Sinclairs never got a penny back. What happened to the Sinclair family? The father, Robert Sinclair, shot himself in 1985. The mother died of cancer a year later. They had one daughter, who would be in her late 40s now. She disappeared from public records after her mother's funeral. No address, no employment history, nothing. What was her name? There was a pause as Jimmy consulted his notes. Moira. Moira Sinclair. The pieces fell into place with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Moira Stewart wasn't just the village schoolteacher. She was Moira Sinclair, the daughter of the man whose life had been destroyed by Julian Vane's father. She'd hidden herself in plain sight for over a decade, waiting for the chance to reclaim her family's heritage and exact revenge on the son of the man who'd ruined her family. "Jimmy, I need you to keep this quiet. Don't tell Blair yet." "Why not?" "Because Blair will arrest her and make a hash of it. I need to handle this carefully." "Hamish, you can't sit on evidence in a murder investigation." "I'm not sitting on it. I'm gathering it properly. Give me 24 hours. After a long pause, Jimmy sighed. 24 hours. After that, I'm going to Blair whether you're ready or not." Hamish hung up and stared out the window at the loch. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and indifferent to the small human dramas played out in their shadow. Moira Sinclair had murdered Julian Vane to avenge her father and reclaim her ancestral home. She'd framed Archie to protect herself, manufacturing evidence with the same careful planning she brought to her classroom. Now Hamish had to prove it, and he had less than a day to do it before an innocent man was formally charged with murder. He fed Lugs and Sonsie, then sat down with his notebook to work out exactly how Moira had committed the murder and escaped from a locked room. The answer was there, somewhere in the details he'd already collected. He just needed to see it. Outside, night fell over Lochdubh, and in a neat cottage Moira Sinclair probably slept the sleep of the righteous, believing she'd got away with the perfect crime. She was wrong. Chapter 8. The Schoolteacher's Flaw. Hamish woke before dawn with the solution clear in his mind. He'd fallen asleep at his desk, his head pillowed on his notes, and somewhere in his dreams the locked room puzzle had unravelled itself. The secret wasn't how Moira had escaped. It was that she'd never needed to. He made himself tea and reviewed the timeline Moira herself had provided to Blair. She'd claimed Vane was researching a specific Highland history book the night he died. The red leather volume about the great houses of Sutherland, the one with the architectural plans showing the old servants' passages. But those passages had been sealed during the 1960s renovations. Hamish had checked the building records himself. So why had Moira mentioned that particular book, unless she was trying to plant the idea of a secret escape route that didn't exist? Because she wanted everyone looking for an impossible solution, instead of seeing the obvious one. Hamish pulled out the photographs he'd taken of the crime scene. The bolt on the inside of the door, the closed windows, the body lying in the centre of the room with the book press beside it. What if the room had never been locked from the inside during the murder? What if Moira had killed Vane, left the room, and only later returned to bolt the door from inside before exiting through some other means? He looked again at the architectural plans in the history book. The servants' passages were gone, yes, but there was something else. A small notation in the corner of the blueprint showing a dumbwaiter shaft, used in the original house to send meals from the kitchen to the upper floors. Hamish grabbed his keys and drove through the pre-dawn darkness to the Heritage Centre. He let himself in and went straight to the archives, this time looking at the room with fresh eyes. The bookshelves along the north wall were built in, original to the house. Hamish began pulling books off the shelves, examining the wall behind them. 3/4 of the way along, his fingers found what he was looking for, a seam in the panelling barely visible that suggested a door. He pressed and pulled at the panels until one slid sideways, with a grinding sound of wood on wood. Behind it was a narrow shaft, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The old dumbwaiter mechanism was long gone, but wooden crossbeams remained at regular intervals, forming a crude ladder. Hamish climbed up, his torch illuminating the tight space. The shaft rose 2 floors and ended at another panel, this one opening onto what had been the servants' quarters and was now used for storage. From there, it would be simple to walk down the main staircase and out the front door. Moira had killed Vane, climbed up through the shaft, then returned hours later through the front door with her key. She'd descended through the shaft, bolted the door from the inside to create the locked room mystery, then climbed back up and left normally. Anyone checking the building would find the archives securely locked from within, and the only keys in the possession of Matthew and Moira herself. It was elegant, simple, and it required intimate knowledge of the building's original structure. The kind of knowledge someone who'd grown up in the house would have. But there was still the matter of proof. Hamish needed something concrete, something that would stand up in court. He thought about the coloured chalk dust and the scrap of Victorian wallpaper. The wallpaper could have come from anywhere in the old building, perhaps preserved in some forgotten corner, but the chalk was specific. Teachers used it daily, and Moira would have traces of it on her clothing, in her pockets, ground into the fabric of her life. More than that, Hamish remembered her bringing him scones that first night, and coffee to Blair's team the next morning. Always helpful, always present. But she'd made one small mistake in her helpfulness. He pulled out his notebook and found the list she'd given Blair of everyone Vane had spoken to at the pub. It was detailed and thorough, listing not just names but approximate times and what had been said. Too detailed. Moira claimed she'd compiled it from memory after the murder, but some of the conversations she'd documented had happened before she'd arrived at the pub that evening. Hamish had checked with several witnesses. Moira hadn't shown up until after 8 o'clock, but she'd listed conversations that happened at 7:30, which meant she'd been watching and listening earlier, perhaps from outside the pub windows, or she'd made parts of it up. Either way, it showed a level of calculation and attention that contradicted her gentle, absent-minded teacher persona. Then there was the threatening note. Hamish had photographed it alongside samples of Archie's genuine handwriting. The more he studied them, the more certain he became that they'd been written by different people. The note was too careful, too deliberate, the shaky quality achieved through effort rather than genuine intoxication or emotion. And he'd watched Moira plant the anonymous letter with his own eyes. It was circumstantial, all of it. But together with the dumbwaiter shaft and Moira's true identity as Moira Sinclair, it painted a damning picture. Hamish photographed the hidden shaft thoroughly, then climbed back down and replaced the panel. He needed one more piece of evidence, something that would prove beyond doubt that Moira had been in these archives the night of the murder. He thought about the wallpaper clutched in Vane's hand. Victorian era, floral pattern. The forensics report had been specific. If he could find where that wallpaper came from, and if it was somewhere only Moira would know about. Hamish began a systematic search of the building, paying particular attention to storage areas and spaces that hadn't been touched during the renovations. In what had been the old housekeeper's pantry, now used to store cleaning supplies, he found it. Behind a shelf of industrial disinfectant, a section of the original wallpaper remained, protected from decades of redecoration by the bulk of the shelving unit. The pattern matched the scrap from Vane's hand exactly. Faded roses on a cream background, delicate as old lace. Hamish photographed it, then carefully peeled away a small sample. This was Moira's childhood home. She would have known every inch of it, including which rooms still held traces of the past. Vane must have grabbed at her during the struggle, and be catching hold of this scrap she'd been carrying, perhaps a keepsake from her old life, or perhaps something she'd torn away in anger during the confrontation. As the sun rose over Lochdubh, Hamish sat in his Land Rover outside the Heritage Centre and called Jimmy Anderson. I've got enough to bring her in for questioning. The hidden shaft, the wallpaper, the forged notes. But I want to do this quietly, Jimmy. No press, no Blair grandstanding. Blair's not going to like being cut out of the arrest. Blair's arrested the wrong man and is about to charge him. I'd say his opinion doesn't count for much right now. There was a pause, then Jimmy chuckled. Aye, you've got a point. How do you want to handle it? I'll talk to her first, give her a chance to confess. If she's been carrying this for 40 years, i.e. she might want to finally tell someone the truth. And if she doesn't confess, then we'll arrest her the hard way. But I think she will, Jimmy. I think she's been waiting for someone to figure it out. The perfect crime is no good if no one knows how clever you've been. After he hung up, Hamish drove slowly through the waking village. Smoke rose from chimneys. The fishing boats were heading out for the day's catch. Mrs. Wellington was already at the church, preparing for morning service. It was Lochdubh as it had always been, peaceful and eternal, except that in the neat schoolhouse cottage, a murderer was probably making her morning tea, confident that she'd committed the perfect crime and framed an innocent man for it. Hamish thought about Moira's father, destroyed by Gerald Vane's greed. He thought about a young woman watching her family disintegrate, planning revenge across decades. He even felt a twinge of sympathy for her, but sympathy didn't change the facts. Julian Vane had been a blackmailer and a bully, but he hadn't deserved to die, and Archie McLean certainly didn't deserve to hang for a crime he didn't commit. Hamish parked outside the schoolhouse and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he climbed out, walked up the neat garden path, and knocked on the door. It was time for the helpful Mrs. Stewart to stop being helpful and start being honest. Chapter 9. Sins of the Past. Moira answered the door in her dressing gown, her grey-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. For a moment she looked genuinely surprised. Then her expression settled into its usual gentle concern. "Hamish, is something wrong? It's rather early." "I need to talk to you, Moira. May I come in?" She stepped aside and Hamish entered the cottage he'd visited dozens of times over the years for school events and village meetings. It was exactly as he remembered. Neat as a pin, with children's artwork on the walls and shelves lined with teaching materials and history books. Moira put the kettle on without asking, moving through the familiar ritual of Highland hospitality. But Hamish noticed her hands tremble slightly as she reached for the cups. "You know, don't you?" she said quietly, not turning around. Aye. I know who you are, Moira Sinclair, and I know what you did." She was silent for a long moment, then poured the tea with steady hands and brought the cups to the table. When she finally looked at him, the gentle schoolteacher had vanished entirely. In her place sat a woman with steel in her spine and 40 years of carefully controlled rage in her eyes. "How did you work it out?" The wallpaper was the first real clue, Victorian floral pattern found in Vane's hand. There's only one place in the Heritage Centre where that paper still exists, hidden behind a shelf in the old housekeeper's pantry. Only someone who'd lived in that house as a child would know it was there. Moira smiled faintly. "I used to hide there when I was little, playing at being invisible. I suppose old habits die hard." The dumbwaiter shaft was clever. "You killed him, climbed up through it, then came back later to bolt the door from the inside and create your locked room mystery. You found the shaft then. I thought the bookshelf disguised it well enough. But I suppose I underestimated you, Hamish. Blair certainly did. Why frame Archie? He never did you any harm." "I needed someone to take the blame. Archie was convenient, loud, drunk, with obvious motive from the ledger, and if I'm honest, I didn't care much who suffered as long as justice was done for my family." She sipped her tea calmly. "Does that shock you?" "It saddens me. You could have come forward years ago, told people what Gerald Vane did to your family. The law might have helped you." Moira laughed, a bitter sound. "The law? My father went to the law, Hamish. Do you know what they told him? That he should have read the contracts more carefully, that he was a fool for trusting a business partner. They did nothing while we lost everything. Our home, our savings, our reputation. And then Gerald Vane bought our house at auction for a fraction of its value and gave it to the village as a tax write-off. A generous benefactor, they called him. So you came back to Lochdubh under a false name." "Stewart was my mother's maiden name. I changed it legally after she died. No one here remembered the Sinclair girl who'd left at 16. I was just another teacher looking for a quiet place to work. It took me years to build the life I have here. The trust, the position. All while you waited for Julian Vane to show up. I didn't know he would, but when I heard he'd inherited his father's estate, I knew it was only a matter of time. Men like him can't resist gloating over their ill-gotten gains." Her voice hardened. "When he walked into that pub and started threatening everyone, I almost laughed. He was just like his father, arrogant, cruel, using other people's secrets to get what he wanted. What happened that night, Moira? Tell me the truth." She stood and walked to the window looking out at the village. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were recounting someone else's story. "I went to see him at the archives. I still had my key from my research work. He was going through the old property records, making his nasty little notes in that ledger of his. I told him who I was. I wanted him to know that a Sinclair was going to stop him from destroying more lives the way his father destroyed ours." "What did he say?" "He laughed. Said my father was a weak fool who deserved what he got. Then he told me about the artifacts." Hamish frowned. "What artifacts?" "My father, in his desperation, had taken some valuable pieces from the house before the auction. Georgian silver, some jewellery that had been my mother's. He hid them somewhere in the building, thinking he'd retrieve them later and sell them to pay off some of the debts. But he never got the chance. He killed himself before he could tell anyone where they were. And Vane found them. He'd been searching the building, looking for anything of value. That's what those secret letters were really about. Not property deeds, but my father's notes about where he'd hidden our family treasures. Vane was going to take them, sell them, and keep the money. He said I could watch him do it. Knowing I had no legal claim to anything that had been in the house. So you killed him." I picked up that book press and I struck him. Hard. I meant to kill him, Hamish. I won't pretend it was an accident or that I didn't know what I was doing. I wanted him dead for what his father did, for what he was doing, for every cruel word and mocking laugh. She turned to face him, her eyes dry. "And I don't regret it. Not for a single moment." Hamish felt the weight of her confession settle over the room like a shroud. "You do understand I have to arrest you?" "Of course. I've known since I saw you watching my cottage the other night. You're not as subtle as you think, standing in the shadows." She smiled sadly. "I could have run. I have money saved, a passport. I could have been in France by now. But I'm tired, Hamish. I've been carrying this for so long. Maybe it's time to put it down." "What about the artifacts? Did you find them?" "After I killed him, yes. They were hidden in a cavity behind the fireplace in what used to be my father's study. Not worth as much as I'd hoped after 40 years, but enough. I've already donated them to the Highland Museum in my father's name. Let something good come from all this misery." She moved to the bedroom and emerged a few minutes later, dressed in a neat skirt and cardigan, her hair pinned back in its usual bun. The transformation was complete. She was Mrs. Stewart again, the helpful schoolteacher, except for the haunted look in her eyes. "I need to make arrangements for my class. Mrs. MacLeod can take over until they find a replacement, and I should call a solicitor. Jimmy Anderson's on his way." "You'll be treated fairly, Moira." "More fairly than my father was, I'm sure." She picked up her handbag and coat. "Shall we go? I'd rather leave before the village wakes up properly. I don't want the children to see me in handcuffs." As they walked to Hamish's Land Rover, the sun broke through the morning clouds, turning the loch to hammered silver. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind that made you grateful to be alive in the Highlands. "I did love it here, you know," Moira said softly. "The teaching, the village life, the children. It wasn't all pretense. For a while I thought I might be able to forget the past and just be happy. But you couldn't. No, the past doesn't forget, Hamish. It just waits." Jimmy Anderson arrived with a female officer, and they took Moira away with quiet efficiency. No dramatics, no protests. She went willingly, with dignity, like a woman who'd finally finished a long and exhausting journey. Hamish stood in the empty road and watched the car disappear towards Strathbane. In a few hours, Blair would be informed that he'd arrested the wrong person. Archie would be released with grudging apologies. The press would have their story about the schoolteacher who murdered for revenge. And Hamish would once again be labelled as the lazy constable who'd got lucky, too incompetent for promotion, destined to stay in his beloved Lochdubh forever. He smiled. It was exactly what he wanted. Chapter 10. The Lazy Constable's Justice. The village school sat empty and quiet, its windows dark in the afternoon light. Hamish stood looking at it for a long moment, thinking about all the children Moira had taught over the years, all the lives she'd touched with her patience and kindness. It seemed impossible to reconcile the gentle teacher with the woman who'd crushed a man's skull and framed an innocent fisherman without a flicker of remorse. But the Highlands had always understood that people were complicated. Good and evil didn't exist in neat separate boxes. They lived side by side in the same heart, waiting to see which one circumstance would call forth. Hamish drove to Strathbane, where he found Jimmy Anderson looking harassed and Blair looking apoplectic. "You let her confess without me present," Blair roared. I saw his fat face purple with rage. "You took a murder confession from a suspect in a case I was investigating." "You'd arrested the wrong man," Hamish said mildly. "I simply corrected your mistake." Mistake? There was no mistake. The evidence against McLean was solid. The evidence was manufactured by the actual killer. Moira Stewart forged the threatening note and planted the anonymous letter. She knew about the boot prints because she'd seen them herself when she scouted the building. She fed you exactly what you wanted to hear, and you swallowed it whole. Blair looked like he might have a stroke. "I'll have your badge for this, Macbeth. Going behind my back, conducting unauthorized investigations." "Solving your case, you mean?" Jimmy interrupted. "Hamish cracked a locked room murder and got a full confession. The press are going to love it." This stopped Blair mid-rant. Hamish could see the wheels turning in the detective's head. A locked room mystery solved, a dramatic arrest, and best of all, Blair could claim credit for the whole thing if he played it right. "Well," Blair said, smoothing down his jacket, "I suppose the constable did follow up on leads I'd identified, working under my direct supervision, of course." "Of course," Hamish agreed, keeping his expression neutral. "And it was my investigation that uncovered the dumbwaiter shaft and the connection to the Sinclair family." "Absolutely!" Blair's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You're being very agreeable, Macbeth. What's your game?" "No game, sir. I'm just happy justice was done, and grateful to have learned so much from your expert handling of the case." This was laying it on thick, but Blair preened like a rooster. "Yes, well, this should look very good in my file. Might even warrant a commendation from headquarters." After Blair bustled off to prepare for another press conference, Jimmy leaned against the wall and grinned at Hamish. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth." "I'm a lazy man who wants to keep his quiet posting in Lochdubh. If Blair takes the credit, he won't push for my promotion." "Aye, there's that. Though I still don't understand why you'd turn down a chance at advancement." Hamish thought about his croft house overlooking the loch, his sheep grazing in the field, lugs and sonsy waiting by the fire. He thought about village life, where he knew everyone's business and they knew his, where a constable could bend the rules to protect a salmon poacher because it was the right thing to do. "Some of us aren't meant for the big city, Jimmy. I'm happy where I am." "Fair enough. What about Archie? Someone should tell him he's free to go." "I'll handle it. It's the least I can do after he spent 2 days thinking he was going to prison for murder." Archie McLean emerged from the holding cells looking stunned and exhausted. When Hamish explained what had happened, the fisherman sank onto a bench and put his head in his hands. "Mrs. Stewart? Our Mrs. Stewart killed that man?" "I'm afraid so. But she's so nice. She helped my youngest with her reading. Never raised her voice, even when the wee one was being difficult." "People are complicated, Archie." "I suppose they are." He looked up. His weathered face creased with worry. "Morag's going to kill me when she finds out I wasn't actually helping Ian with stock-taking. She'll know I was hiding from her. I'd say you've earned the right to a bit of peace and quiet after this ordeal. Tell her the truth. She might surprise you." Hamish drove Archie back to Lochdubh, where Morag was waiting on the doorstep. She flew down the path and threw her arms around her husband, tears streaming down her face. "I knew you didn't do it, you daft man. I told them, but they wouldn't listen." "I'm sorry, Morag. About the hiding and the lying and the whiskey fund. We'll talk about that later. Right now, I'm just glad you're home." As Hamish watched them walk into their cottage together, thirsty, he reflected that sometimes the best outcome of a murder investigation was seeing what it did to the living. Archie and Morag would probably be fine. They'd row and make up and carry on as they always had, a little wiser and perhaps a little kinder to each other. The village was already buzzing with the news by the time Hamish reached his station. The Curry sisters flagged him down to express their shock. Angus MacDonald claimed he had predicted the whole thing in a vision. Dr. Brodie stopped by to apologise for lying about his alibi, bringing a bottle of whiskey as penance. "Keep it," Hamish said. "You'll need it more than me after Moira's trial. The press will be all over the village for weeks." As evening fell, Hamish fed his animals and settled into his armchair with a cup of tea and a piece of shortbread. The fire crackled in the grate. Lugg snored gently at his feet. Sonsi draped herself across the back of the chair, her wild purr rumbling through the quiet room. The telephone rang, and Hamish considered not answering it. But duty was duty, even for a lazy constable. It was Reverend Wellington. "Hamish, I've just heard about Moira. Terrible business. The village is in shock." "Aye, it's been a difficult few days. I wanted to ask, will you be attending the service on Sunday? I think the community needs to come together to remember that even good people can do terrible things when consumed by grief and anger." "I'll be there, Reverend." After he hung up, Hamish thought about Moira sitting in a cell in Strathbane, facing a trial and a sentence that would likely mean she'd spend the rest of her life in prison. Or she'd killed a man who deserved killing, if anyone did. But that didn't change the fact that she'd also nearly destroyed an innocent man to cover her tracks. Justice was a complicated thing in the Highlands. The law said Moira was a murderer who'd be punished. But Hamish suspected that some in the village, once they learned the full story, would think she'd simply done what needed doing. He didn't have an answer to that moral puzzle, and he was glad it wasn't his job to find one. Let the judges and juries sort it out. He was just a lazy constable who wanted to keep his peaceful life intact. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jimmy Anderson, holding a bottle of whiskey and looking pleased with himself. Blair's press conference was a thing of beauty. He's taking full credit, naturally. "You've been mentioned as his capable assistant who followed orders admirably. You should be safe from promotion for another year at least. Thank God for small mercies." They sat by the fire and shared the whiskey, talking about everything except the case, about fishing and football and the terrible state of the roads, about Jimmy's ongoing disasters with women and Hamish's contentment with bachelorhood. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed in the city?" Jimmy asked. "You could have made inspector by now, maybe even superintendent, and spent my days filling out forms and attending meetings. No thank you. I'd rather be here, solving the occasional murder and mostly just keeping the peace." "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth." "Aye, but I'm a happy one." After Jimmy left, Hamish stood at his window and looked out at the loch. The moon was rising, painting a silver path across the dark water. The mountains stood silent against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in the village, people were settling in for the night, safe in their homes, their secrets kept or revealed, their lives continuing in the ancient rhythm of Highland existence. Tomorrow there would be more gossip, more questions, more disruption as the press descended on Lochdubh. Blair would give interviews and take credit. Moira would begin her journey through the justice system. The village would slowly heal and move on, as it always did. But tonight, Hamish was content. The case was solved. An innocent man was free. Justice, in its complicated Highland way, had been served. He shared a final piece of shortbread with Lugs and Sonsi, banked the fire and went to bed, secure in the knowledge that he'd remain Police Constable Hamish Macbeth of Lochdubh for a good while longer. And that was exactly how he wanted it.